Now, later this year, as you all well know, Australia will host a referendum on a very crucial constitutional issue, changing the constitution to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' views are better represented in Parliament. Please welcome Warran.
I want to pay respect to Mr. Yunupingu's passing because I do have a kinship relationship with the people up in the Yolngu country through my brother and children. So it was a great champion who passed away. For me, I'm a practical man. I'm outcome driven. I'm a great believer in the economic development of Australia as well as the economic development of Indigenous Australians as well. And I'll talk through some of those things at all. And Shireen had raised the issue that I spoke about in, was it 2016, 2017? That's right, which is true. And and why is that true? Because I'm a First Nations person. I believe in First Nations. I'm not a great fan of people sitting in Canberra making decisions about Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders. I'm a great believer in recognition of those First Nations as the true country people who can only speak for country and who only can make decisions for country. And I've been very strong in that, even if I disagreed with people. When people make decisions about mining projects, pro or negative, I've supported every one of those Aboriginal people who made those decisions because it's their country, it is their voice, and that's the voice that needs to be heard. We need to have governments who are at all levels, state, territory, federal and local, who speak directly to those countrymen and countrywomen and making decisions about their lives and their things that involve them. Yes, there have been many great policies over the years, but there have been bad policies, but the good ones have been stifled by the implementations, how they happened, and so on. But there have been some great things because I've always believed in the economic power of people if they really want to be able to break out of poverty and to move ahead. I gave a speech to the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council many years ago, and I said, what is the number of farmers, percentage of farmers in New South Wales? And it was 1%. And I said, what is the percentage of Aboriginals in New South Wales? And they said 3%. So why are people not listening to Aboriginals? And it is about economic power. So I've taken that road of empowering people for economic stuff. And here are some of the statistics when I was chair of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. People only remember Abbott, but I was also, for several years, Turnbull's advisor as well on Indigenous issues. And those things that I focused on were how do we lift people out of poverty? And the only way to do that is through an economy. And so we started out in 2015 with the IPP. Needs a bit of a shake-up these days, but it was a good start. $6.2 million was going to Indigenous businesses from the federal government. As of this year, it's $6.9 billion. So within 8 years, we was able to drag that up. We got 45,434 people now employed in the Indigenous business sector. We have, you look at the mining industry and it's, the Indigenous business industry put together, that's $4.9 billion annually going into that sector. The growth of Indigenous business has been going up since that time by 117%. I see these things as the answer to Indigenous poverty. I see the answer to this in regard to crime. I see the answer to this in ways that really work for Aboriginal people out. And I'll be quite frank, when Ken Wyatt became the Minister for Indigenous Australians, that all went out the window. They set up a committee called the Coalition of the Peak. No business people on that. No one knew anything about that. And it stalled. The whole process stalled. He also defunded Aboriginal education by several $1 million. So if you look at me and say I'm a friend of Ken Wyatt, I'm not. He's stifled our growth and he's caused massive problems. So for me, having voices which have been there since 1973 have not made a difference. My argument is about empowering those First Nation people, recognising those First Nation people, and I do believe in recognition within the Constitution, recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first people of this country. And for us, I'm very proud of some things that have come out of this debate, and that is the generosity of the Australian people. They get bagged all the time about being racist and stuff, but when you talk about getting recognition of Aboriginal people within the Constitution, you'll get about 90% tick. And how do I know that? We did polling. You'll get a 90% tick. And so for me, it is about practical things and how do you build environments for people to be able to be free, to make their own choices and to move forward. I see the voice, and I've got a critique coming out in the next couple of days in regard to the critique of the Kalmar-Langton review, and that is a 5-series review of that paper, and it is going to be pretty damning of that paper. I see that putting in place a second bureaucracy around Indigenous people, creating regions when we got our own nations, as going in the wrong direction and actually going to be stifling the development of our communities. Who do we trust in this whole debate? And as I said, I'm a practical man, so I see what people's actions are more importantly than what their mouth says. And what I've seen over the years, I've been around a long time, it may surprise you that I'm an old bloke. So I know you're looking at me thinking, gee, he's young, you know. but you know, Albanese as the Prime Minister has really, really let us down in the trust section. He was asked several questions by the leader of the opposition. He didn't answer them. He was asked to release the Solicitor General's what he was saying about the voice of Parliament, and I don't know what it was, positive or negative or whatever. No one knows really, except the people who was in that room. So you know, when I see these things like Albanese going to Alice Springs, he only went there because he was dragged there by the media, and then he disappeared after a few hours. And it's not only Alice Springs. Alice Springs is the tip of the iceberg. You see Laverton, you see community after community, Sejuna and that. Prior to the COVID, I spent 3 days a week in Aboriginal communities across Australia, talking to people, listening to people. I always do 3 things: you listen, you observe, and then you talk. And I just was shocked how bad things had gone backwards. The biggest problem we have yes, we have a problem with the disparity between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals, but that's nothing compared to the disparity between regional and remote Aboriginals and Aboriginals in cities and large provincial towns. It is a disaster and it's going backwards. And I really do not trust people who have been put in this position to campaign for the voice. And it seems to me like a happy clappy. And also I don't like being racially abused too, by people like Noel Pearson and Brett Walker and a few other people. When my track record, I would say, in Indigenous affairs is second to none. My fight for First Nations, my fight for belief in Aboriginal people has never ever, shifted.
Warran, the 1967 referendum is still unfinished business, and there's overwhelming support for some kind of constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. But she makes it clear that the preamble that then Prime Minister John Howard put to the people in the 1999 referendum was overwhelmingly rejected. Your response?
Oh, it's very simple. I was alive in 1967. My older brothers and sisters actually campaigned in the 67 referendum. Cherie's right in regard to there is still unfinished business to be done within the Constitution. The thing about the Constitution, and people talk about symbolism not being strong, was that within 3 years of that 67 constitutional change, virtually every state government in Australia got rid of discriminatory laws against Aboriginals. So in a very short time, 3-5 years, these all disappeared. And then what happened was, in the late 60s, you had people like John Gordon bringing forward the AB study, a policy which was to help Aboriginal kids get to school, help people going along, help people get to universities, and a whole wide range of things started to happen. Neville Bonner was, in 1971, was appointed to the Senate. In 1972, was elected to the Senate. You had a number of state, Northern Territory, Queensland, all within a few years, elected Aboriginal people to those parliaments. You have organisations that were set up: the Aboriginal Medical Services, the Aboriginal Legal Services, and a wide range of other things that were set up during that period. And then you've seen that, like when I was a kid, Charles Perkins and John Moriarty come to our town, and we knew he was, and I always remind John Moriarty about this, that I was a 6-year-old kid and he was a university graduate, is that we didn't even know what a university was, but we thought it was important because people were talking in whispers about these two men coming to our community. You could count on one hand how many Aboriginal people were going to university. Now it's thousands. You've got doctors, you've got accountants, you've got engineers. I was going to say lawyers.
But Warran, still no Indigenous constitutional recognition.
We are recognised, whether people like it or not, we are recognised in the Constitution because we're citizens of this country. And as citizens of this country, we are, everything about the Constitution affects us, just as it affects everyone else. And this is why I find it strange that people will say it's only about things that affect Aboriginal people. I was told last year when I stood up and said, well, that means everything because we're Australian citizens. So every law that goes through, every policy that goes through is about us. And so I said it is going to affect a lot of things. You look at, what's her name on the weekend, Megan Davis, professor at New South Wales University, professor of law. She said it's everything. 2001, I was working on the ALP Senate campaign, and we were going into Aboriginal communities, having meetings, having scones and tea and all that type of stuff, and talking about policies and that. Community after community I went into, people pulled me aside because I was the only Aboriginal with the group of ALP people coming out to meet with those communities. And the women pulled me aside, and community after community, they talked about the issues within their community, and of violence and abuse, child abuse, and stuff like that. And me coming out of that campaign was like, I was just shattered about how much there is problems in a lot of our communities, not all of them, but a lot of them from that personal experience that I had. And I see a lot of this stuff not changing in some of these communities. It is something, one of the things we've got to really face is the alcohol, the crime and the things that are happening in Alice Springs is because of problems behind that, and we have to focus on those problems to stop it.
Yeah, one of the arguments that the advocates of The Voice make is the case for a treaty. Now, Angela from Brisbane, Queensland, makes the point that Australia differs from other Western nations that grew out of British colonies such as Canada and New Zealand because there was never a treaty process between our Indigenous people and the colonising power, Native American tribal sovereignty is also recognised in the US Constitution, she says. And she concludes treaties were not always complied with or executed in good faith, but Australia is quite unique in that we don't have those foundation documents that even recognise the existence of First Nations people. Can't we finally redress this wrong? Jacinta Warran.
I'll bow to Tony on this stuff because he's more of an expert about this. But for my readings and for my observation, and that you do, and you go to America and you go to Canada, you do see these sovereignty issues. They have their, especially the United States, and that they have their own police force, they have their own courts, they have those own things that are happening within those areas, and they're like a territory, a state that operate within the United States, and I've looked and observed those type of things. Yes, I do agree that we're one of the odd ones out, that we never had a treaty, we never had those discussions. It was all terra nullius up until recently. And so we're coming from behind the eight ball to get on top of a lot of this stuff.
Why can't we do a Canada with a lot of harmony and less division? Warran?
I actually, people probably wouldn't remember, I actually back in 2015 put forward a notion about that, which was about that race law. I said it should be, because I looked at Canada, I looked at United States, I looked at New Zealand and that, where they have those clauses and protection of sovereign Indigenous rights, and I learnt also that Canadians call themselves Aboriginals too, so that was interesting. But which was that the Commonwealth government should be able to make agreements with First Nation people, and that just got lost in all the rhetoric and all the arguments that went along that ground. I believe that Australia, and I concur with Jacinta on this, is that we are a tolerant and very respected and incredible nation, and people aren't jumping on boats to leave Australia unless they're on P&O, and that people are coming here and risking their lives to come here. But for me, it is about. I looked at that about the treaty rights and working with Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, and having the Commonwealth to have those powers in regard to that. And that was one of my arguments back in the early days. My concern with the voice, of course, we're setting up regional and local groups and that, which is bypassing those nations who should have those recognitions and that. And we could be like Canada, we could be like New Zealand, we could be like, I'm talking about positively in regard to how we have our relationships with each other. I was the elected councillor at Dubbo City Council many years ago, and I was deputy mayor for a while. What I discovered when I was in that room is that my vote was equal to everyone else in that room. And I could work with my fellow councillors, I could fight with them, I could do things, and we could do changes in that. I've always been a believer that you need to, we need to get more Aboriginals into Parliament. And I worked on that, and we got those amazing people who are sitting in Parliament today. And I predict that over the next two elections, those figures will go up to about 20 people who will be elected at Parliament, and we'll have ministers, and we'll have a whole wide range of people that are doing it. I beg to be corrected here, but I think it's about 34 Aboriginals who sit in Parliament around Australia in all different jurisdictions. This is the way forward. Economic development, education, and dealing with people on the ground will make the differences, and that will empower Aboriginal people to make a change. To me, I haven't been convinced in regard to the voice being anything that is going over a layer over traditional owners and First Nations, and that it's going to have a huge bureaucracy, because if they're going to be looking at all legislation and policies, they're going to need experts in every different area. They're going to need support services. We're just going to build this massive thing where money should be spent out there on the ground.